This week's painting tutorial is going to be a nice and easy one. As you can see, we'll be painting the smoke from a candle right after the flame is extinguished. So only two colors are going to be needed for this simple painting, just black and white. And we're going to be focusing in a lot on the drawing, meaning the placement of edges, the softness and hardness of those edges, and of course the values. This one is a great practice piece to build up some airbrush control, to practice your observation, and it's a fun one to paint. If you're going to be painting this one, up on the screen now is a high resolution photo of my completed painting, so feel free to use this as your reference. So the first thing you're going to need to do is transfer your lines over to the surface that you're painting on, whether it's paper, a panel, or canvas. I'm painting this one on an 11 by 14 inch panel. It's a piece of MDF. I put on about 2 layers of gesso and then wet sanded it with 120 grit sandpaper. And just like I always do, the way that I transferred my drawing over was by setting up a 1x1 grid and then drawing it looking at the reference. I know that some people aren't crazy about using a grid, so if you want to use a projector or print it out and trace it, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Any way to get your lines or your contours onto your panel. And if you want to see how I use a grid to draw, the latest video I have on that is the one I'm painting the ear from a few weeks back, so check that one out. On the left side of the screen, I'm placing up my completed painting so you can see what we're working towards. One of the quickest ways to paint this one would be to paint the entire background in black first, and then use opaque colors to paint in the candle and the smoke right on top of that background. That way it's just fine, it'll go quicker. But a lot of times when you're painting, the background isn't going to be a solid color. Most of the time, there's going to be a lot of stuff going on within that background. Different values, different textures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint this in negatively. I'm going to start by using some black paint within my airbrush, lining it up with my initial drawing, and then start spraying in the background behind the candle. So this way, I'm going to be leaving negative space, meaning that white gessoed panel, completely empty where the candle and the smoke is going to be. The color in my airbrush right now is black. I'm spraying it right out of the bottle at around 25 psi through a micron. You could use any airbrush you'd like for this. The first thing I did here was use a freehand shield. This is one made by Art Tool. I lined it up with the left side of the candle and then started spraying in that black paint into the background. You could think of this area that I'm painting in right now as the transition point, that transition between the candle and the background. For this part of the background just above the candle where the wick is going to be, the transition point is going to be a little bit softer, so I'll paint this in freehand to give myself a softer edge. And so now if you look at my completed painting on the left side, you'll notice that where the smoke starts, there's going to be a very sharp edge, a very sharp transition between the smoke and the black background. In order to paint that edge in very sharp, I'm going to need some tool to help me out because the airbrush is naturally giving you a soft line and a soft transition. So I'm going to go right back over to the freehand shield. Using something like frisket will work just fine, but I think the freehand shield is going to be a little bit quicker here. So I lined it up with the left side and again started spraying in that black paint over to the left into the background. For the right side of the smoke, I'm going to use a different shield here. This one is called the Bird, made by Art Tool. I love this shield. I'm using it all the time. And again, I'm just going to line this up with my initial drawing and then this time spray the paint over to the right to start spraying in the background on the other side. And just a tip, try to go light with your paint. It's a transparent paint, so the way that you make it darker is just by spraying more of it. I don't want to spray too much here right away because I don't want any of it running underneath the shield. And you can see when I remove my shield here that the negative space between the black paint is starting to take the shape of that candle. If you look at this area that I'm circling right here, the area just above the wick where the smoke starts, the transition is a little bit softer here. So I'll use the airbrush freehand, start spraying in that black paint, kind of like that triangle shape, and just do it freehand to give me soft edges. And you can clearly see the major difference between an edge painted with a shield and an edge painted in freehand. One is much softer than the other, and this is going to work really well for the effect that we're going for within this painting. And as I'm working my way up here, the smoke starts to curve. Again, it's a sharp edge, so I'll be using my shield for this. Once that line is in, I'll switch over to the airbrush freehand and start adding the paint into the left. I'll speed through this because it's just spraying in a solid layer of black paint, but you'll notice here when I'm starting out that I'm kind of angling my airbrush over to the left. Overspray from an airbrush has a way of getting on parts of the painting you least expect. It gets everywhere. The only way to fully block overspray is to mask off areas, but one thing that I like to do is just to kind of mitigate that overspray by angling my airbrush in a certain direction, like I'm doing here to the left. This way that paint is being sprayed in that direction, which is also the direction the overspray is going to go. And what this is going to help do is just prevent some of the overspray from getting to the right of the angle that I'm spraying, which is to the left. Again, overspray is still going to find its way to the right side, but when you do this, you just help mitigate some of that and force the overspray in the direction that you want. Remember that an airbrush is spraying a cone shape, so if you're spraying straight on, that circle is going to give you even overspray in 360 degrees. But if you angle your airbrush in a direction like I'm doing most of the time, spraying over to the left, you could just help control it a little bit more. For the right side of the smoke here, I want this sharp again, so I'm going right back over to that shield, lining it up with my drawing, spraying on the paint. There's also a curve here up above it and to the right, so I'm just going to move this shield around till I find a part of it that fits close enough and then spray it in. If you don't have a shield like this, you could just make some of your own by cutting out some pieces of paper. They work just fine. No shield is ever going to fit a curve perfectly, so you're always just kind of adjusting it, moving it around, getting it to fit as close as you possibly can. And because we're painting smoke here, this is going to be pretty forgiving. I'm still trying to follow the shapes, but it's not like something like a portrait. There, if you get the angles off on something like the structural anatomy, let's say something like the zygomatic bone, part of the cheek, if that's off, it's going to look like a different person, a different portrait. But on this one, with smoke from a candle, we don't have to get it perfect. We're just going to have to get it as close as we can, and it'll be just fine. And now for the right side, to spray in this black background, I'm going to do this freehand. And this time, I'm not going to be angling my airbrush to the left. This time, I'm just pointing it straight on, so I'm going to get that even cone shape. Overspray is, of course, going to find its way onto the candle and onto the smoke. It's not a big deal. We're going to use that to our advantage later on. Before I go any further, some people have asked me, what is this thing that I'm wearing on my hand? This is called the drawing glove, and it's used for mainly digital drawings where you're drawing on a tablet. I use these all the time for digital drawing when I'm just practicing, in Photoshop, just sketching and stuff. But the reason I'm using it here for the airbrush painting is because the video lights that I'm using for these YouTube videos get extremely hot. About an hour into painting, my studio gets so hot from these lights and my hands start to sweat. It's kind of gross, I know, but I don't want that hand resting on the paint, especially Cratex illustration colors, because any sort of moisture is going to have that paint start to lift up and it's just going to make such a mess. So I've been using this just to prevent my hand from resting on the painting. Now, so this part of the smoke has some overspray on it like I was talking about before. So instead of starting to paint over this, what I'm going to do here is use an ink eraser and start erasing into it. And what I'm doing with this ink eraser is just drawing. If you look at my completed painting on the left, you'll notice that this part of the smoke right here at the bottom is brighter than the area just above it. It gets a little bit darker. That's a gradient going from light to dark. And so with my eraser, I'm removing some of the paint in the lighter areas so I know where those highlights are going to be. Because what I'm going to do next is switch over to some lighter opaque paint. And this way I kind of have a guide, like a cheat sheet. I could see where those lighter values are going to be, and I can start spraying more paint into those areas. For most of my paintings, this is the way that I'm going to get my highlights into it, by erasing out the paint, just exposing some of that gesso underneath to give us a lighter value of a hue. But for this one, because it's smoke, the eraser marks are just going to give a little bit too much texture for my liking, so I'll use an opaque white a little bit later. So for now, I'm just going to keep painting with this transparent black paint, and I'm going to use some shields to define the top part of this smoke. I'm speeding up the video a little bit here because I think it's kind of easier to get a sense of what I'm doing. And I'm looking at my reference, paying attention to the curves and also the values within this shape. You can see this area that I'm circling right here. This is the part that I'm working on. I'm noticing that the top part right up here is brighter, and so is the lower part. And then in the center, there's a gradient where it starts to get darker. And on the lower right, in this area right here, you can see that dark just kind of fades into the black background. So I'm trying to add that in. The way that I'm going to get to this is just slowly using a combination of the transparent black and some opaque white a little bit later. Something that I love to do, and I've talked about a bunch of times on the channel, is that when I'm looking for values, what I love to do is squint my eyes. So if you look at the completed painting on the left side of the screen, if you squint your eyes and look at it, you'll be able to see those large masses of dark and light so much easier than if you're just looking at the painting itself. Because sometimes when you're just looking at it normally, you get caught up in the details and you forget those large values of light and dark. But if you squint your eyes, all those details just kind of blur away and you just see the values. And so if we compare my work in progress on the right side of the screen to my completed painting on the left, we can see the differences and what we need to adjust and add. The first thing I'm noticing with the work in progress is that this area right here is too dark. Now, of course, I can erase into that to lighten it up, but like I said, I want this to be very smooth. So I'm going to use an opaque white and start spraying this over the top. And then to spray in this white opaque paint, I'm going to use a shield just like I did before with the black paint. I'm lining this up with that transition point on the left side of the smoke, and then this time I'm spraying over to the right to lighten this area up. And then I'll do the same thing with the right side, just find a part of the shield that fits it close enough and then start spraying in this white paint. White overspray has a way of traveling and getting to a lot of parts of the painting where you're not expecting it. So I'm aware of that. I know that a lot of this black background is going to need to be touched up later on. So instead of fighting the overspray and masking everything off at this point, I'm not really concerned with it. I know that it's going to get on some of the black areas, and I'll just go back to it later with some black paint, spray over it to knock those back down. Now, I apologize that my left arm is blocking this part of the painting. I didn't realize it at the time, but what I did was I laid a shield up on the top right here, and then I just sprayed that white paint down just to brighten up the right side and give me a really sharp edge there. And then I just want to smooth everything out, so I'm just going to fill in the center with some of this white paint. We'll adjust the values later, but for now, I just want to get everything smooth, and this white paint's going to help do that. On the right here, there's a small sharp curve, almost like a semicircle, so I'll use a different shield, just line this up, and then lightly spray this white paint on the right side of it, just kind of spraying on that transition point between the shield and the panel to get in that sharp line. There's a similar small line on the left side, so I'll do the same thing. I'll just line up a shield and then just dust in some paint to give myself that sharp line. And so now at this point, we have that white paint in, but you can clearly see compared to the completed painting on the left that the right side is way too bright in the center. So the way to adjust that, to darken up some of the values within the center of it, I'm going to go right back to that transparent black paint. And remember, with a transparent color, the more you spray, the darker it's going to get. So I'm just trying to add some more of this black paint into the darker areas that I see on the reference. And if I need to get a sharp line, I'll just use my shield like on the top right here and then spray in some of that paint. I'll line up the semicircle of this shield with this curve and then spray some of the black paint below it. And you can see that leaves a little sharp, bright highlight of white above it to give us a thin band of highlight, kind of like a halo effect. And as I was spraying this black paint, some areas got a little bit too dark. That's no problem. We could always adjust that later. We'll switch back to the white paint to lighten up some areas later on. And that's what I did here. I switched back over to the opaque white, used a shield to line up with the edges, and then started spraying in this white paint into the lighter areas. That's going to be down here at the bottom, and I'll make sure I get a gradient by just kind of dusting some more of that paint into the brighter area and letting it kind of fade out into the darker areas. And then I'll do the same thing as I work my way up. I can do some of this freehand because it's a bit softer here. I don't really need a sharp edge, but if I need one, right back over to the shield. So now as we move into the next part of the smoke here, you'll notice that I just left this part blank. I sprayed that black paint all around it and just left it out in the center here. Now I know that some people are not crazy about using freehand shields, and I completely understand it. So another way to go about this is to use some frisket film. To start out, I'm going to use this frisket film just on one curve, this one that I'm circling here on my completed painting. I cut out that shape, and what I'm going to do is just peel back the top part of this frisket. The area that was cut out is still going to stick to that panel, so I could just peel back the top and spray in some of this black paint. Once I remove the frisket film, you can see we get the top part of that curve. I'll use an eraser here just to clean up some overspray. And then what I'm going to do from here is just kind of switch off between using some frisket film and freehand shields. You have to pay attention to what you're seeing, so make sure you pay attention to the reference, my completed painting on the left side of the screen. And you can see that I'm basically using that freehand shield to get to the areas that I didn't with the frisket, kind of like where the frisket ended. I can continue with the freehand shield. And if you work slowly using different shields, you could really combine them to get pretty much any shape you want or any curve you want. The reason that I'm showing you different ways is just so you have the option to choose. For some of the thin lines in here, I'll be using my eraser to start out just to sketch in a few of these highlights. The stick eraser is going to give me a lot more control than the airbrush, so I'm going to use that for now. And then I'm going to go back to a few freehand shields and start lining them up with these other curves. And to paint all of these in, I'm using that negative technique of painting the background first. Now, if you look at this smoke, you'll notice that the sharpest parts of it are on the right, this area that goes up, and then in the center here. This part in the center needs to be sharp, and it has some curves in it that are just kind of tricky to do with a freehand shield, so I'm using some frisket here instead. I'll use that frisket film to mask in the lower part of this smoke, and then for the top, I'll just do it freehand for now and just kind of get everything in place. So that'll set the background in, and then to sharpen up the top part of this line, I'm going to go right back to a shield and spray it in. This part doesn't have to be perfect because I am going to go back to some opaque white. I'm just trying to map in the places right now, so I dusted on a little bit more of this black paint into this area, and then I'm starting to erase out the highlights where I see them. And of course, I'm going to come back over this with some opaque white, but I'm using the eraser now just to sketch in where these highlights are going to be. It's going to be my guide for when I start spraying that white paint over the top. And that's what I'm going to do here. I switched back over to the opaque white paint. I'm going to rework these areas. I'll start on the right side just like I did with the black paint, but now this time instead of adding in the background, I'm adding in the bright areas into the smoke. Of course, I'm still using freehand shields, and you'll notice that as I'm doing this, I'm just masking off one side. I'm not really concerned if that much overspray gets above it in the other direction. Again, it's going to be something that I'll have to clean up at the end of the painting. For now, it's not a big deal. And now finally, for the last part, all the way on the left side, you'll notice that some of the smoke here is going to be softer. The edges just aren't as sharp. And the way that I'll get some of these softer lines in is just by painting freehand, because the airbrush is naturally going to give you a soft transition and soft blends. So I started out by adding in a bit of that black paint into the background on the left side, and then I'm switching over to an airbrush with white paint in it. And you could have some fun with this part. You don't have to follow it exactly. I'm just looking at the shapes and the curves and then doing the best I can to sketch them in freehand. I'll use a shield here and there just to get a few sharper lines. And then I'm also sketching in some thin lines that didn't look so great. Some of these lines almost looked like hair, didn't look like smoke to me. So it was easy to fix. I just went right back over to the black paint, sprayed it over the top, and knocked them back into the background. But the main goal on the left side here is to try to keep most of these lines soft. That's going to make it look like this part is kind of blurring away into the background, and it's going to give a bit of depth to the smoke. And if some of these white lines are too bright or too sharp, I could just use that black paint like I'm doing here and just kind of spray it over, add some gradients, push everything a little bit farther back. And if you do that, if you get those gradients on each one of these, it's going to give the smoke kind of a 3D look where the area that's going into darkness, into shadow, looks like it's moving away. And the brighter area that's catching highlight is going to look like it's a little bit closer. And finally, the last thing I need to do is mask off the right side of this candle, so I'll use some frisket film for that. Once it's masked off, I'll just sketch in the area where the wick is going to be right above it so I could erase that out later. And then I'll go right back into the black paint, start spraying this over the top and to the right. And just a reminder, when you're using frisket film, don't flood the area with paint. You don't want paint running underneath that frisket. Just go slow, build it up in layers, letting each one dry for 30 seconds or so before adding another. Then once the frisket film's off, I'll just use that transparent paint to start spraying in a few of the shadows and highlights within this candle. I'll use the eraser to sketch out a small highlight where the wick is going to be, and then I'll also use this to erase out some vertical lines on the left side of the candle, just to make it look like some light is hitting that area. And that's pretty much it. The only thing I realized I was missing when I was looking at the reference is some small areas of smoke at the very top part of the wick. So this part was easy to add in. I just took a curve from my shield, lined it up where I saw it, and then just dusted on a very small amount of that white paint. And so that's basically it for this one. The black paint is a little bit patchy, so what I did was I used some more black paint, cleaned it up, let it dry, and then I came in with a matte medium and lightly sprayed it over the top. Normally I prefer a gloss varnish, but for the sake of this video, just to make it look even, I sprayed on a thin coating of matte medium or a matte varnish. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you give this one a shot. It's not that difficult of a painting, I promise you that. And the best thing about it is that it's an incredibly forgiving painting because you're only using two colors, black and white. You could switch off between the two anytime you want. If anything gets a little bit too light, you could use some black, spray over the top, knock it back down. Same thing, if anything's too dark, you go right back over to the white. And if you play around with those two colors and use some shields, you'll be able to get this painting to look just as good, if not better than the one I did. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys back here next week. But before I go, of course, I want to say thank you so much to the generous and kind support of the current channel members. I'd also like to welcome the newest member this week, SW. Thank you so much for joining and welcome. Thank you all so much for your continued support. It really means the world to me, and I just want you to know that, so thanks. Have a great week, everybody. I'll see you back here next Friday.